Daniel was not the kind of boy anyone noticed. In a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, he blended into the background like an extra in someone else's movie. At 17, he was polite, quiet, and always carried a book tucked under his arm. Teachers liked him because he never caused trouble. Classmates mostly ignored him, except when they needed help with homework. He walked the hallways of school like a shadow, never loud, never demanding attention. But what nobody knew was that Daniel carried something deeper inside. Behind his calm face and soft steps was a strength that very few could understand. It wasn't the kind of strength that showed in big muscles or flashy behavior. It was the strength that grew slowly, painfully, after loss. When Daniel was only 12, his father died in an accident. His father had been his hero, a man who believed discipline was more important than comfort. He owned a small martial arts school in town, where he taught children to defend themselves, not to fight but to grow strong in body and mind. For Daniel, those lessons became more than just kicks and punches. They became memories, pieces of his father that still lived with him long after the funeral. The day of the funeral stayed etched in Daniel's memory like a scar. He remembered standing in a stiff black suit 2 sizes too big, gripping his mother's hand as people whispered words of pity. Everyone said the same thing: he was such a good man, he'll be missed, be strong for your mother. Daniel listened, nodded, and stayed silent. But in his heart, he promised something to himself: he would keep his father's spirit alive. He would carry the training, the discipline, the lessons, not to show off, but to make sure his father's work never truly ended. So while other kids played video games or hung out at the mall, Daniel spent hours in the quiet of his garage. The old punching bag still hung there, worn from his father's fists and now worn from his own. Wooden sticks, mats, and even the sound of his father's voice seemed to echo in that space. Each movement he practiced felt like a conversation with the man he had lost. At first, he trained because it gave him comfort. But as the years passed, it gave him something else too: confidence. Yet, Daniel never showed it to the world. He didn't strut or brag about his skills. In fact, he carefully hid them. People already thought of him as the quiet kid, and he didn't mind that role. It was easier to stay unnoticed. Easier to stay safe. If someone looked at him, all they saw was a boy with gentle eyes and a calm smile. In school, Daniel often sat by the window, lost in thought. He watched the trees sway in the wind or birds dart across the sky while the classroom buzzed with chatter. His notebooks were filled not only with class notes but with sketches of moves he practiced or words of advice his father once gave him. "Control your breathing," he'd written on one page. "Stay aware," on another. "Never fight with anger," on yet another. Teachers sometimes praised Daniel for being mature beyond his age. They said things like, "You're very responsible," or "You have a wise head on your shoulders." Daniel only nodded. They didn't know the real reason he had no choice but to grow up quickly. When his father passed, he had to become strong for his mother, who worked long hours at a small diner to keep their lives afloat. He cooked dinner for himself most nights, helped with chores, and learned to live with quiet resilience. But deep down, Daniel was still a teenager with emotions that sometimes overwhelmed him. There were nights when he sat in his room, staring at his father's old belt and trophies, wondering what life would have been like if his dad were still there. There were mornings when he woke up feeling tired of being the strong one. Still, he carried on, because he knew his father would want him to. In town, Daniel's presence was so unremarkable that people sometimes forgot he was even there. When bikers started showing up, roaring their engines through the streets, scaring shopkeepers and disturbing the peace, Daniel was one of the many who simply watched from a distance. He didn't approach them, didn't say a word. People whispered about the bikers at the diner, saying they were trouble, but no one dared to confront them. Daniel kept quiet, but inside, something stirred, a mix of unease and awareness. His father had once told him, Real strength is not in winning fights. Real strength is knowing when to stand, and when to walk away. Those words shaped Daniel's choices every day. He avoided conflict, even when teased by classmates, even when pushed aside. To most, he seemed timid. But Daniel knew the truth: he wasn't afraid. He was patient. At night, after finishing his homework, Daniel would return to the garage. The street lights outside barely lit the windows, and the sound of crickets filled the air. He wrapped his fists, tightened his stance, and trained until sweat dripped from his brow. Every move was sharp but controlled, fast but balanced. His breathing steady, his eyes focused. If anyone saw him in those moments, they wouldn't believe he was the same quiet boy from school. They would see the fighter within. Still, Daniel didn't think of himself as a fighter. To him, he was just keeping his father's memory alive. Just making sure that if life ever tested him, he would be ready. He didn't know when or how that test would come. All he knew was that someday, he might need to step out of the shadows he lived in. And when that day arrived, the world would finally see the strength he had carried in silence for so long. The town where Daniel lived had always been a quiet place. People liked it that way. Streets were lined with small shops, each with an owner who knew their customers by name. The diner on Main Street smelled of fresh coffee every morning, the bakery displayed warm bread in its windows, and children played outside without fear. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Then the bikers arrived. At first, they came like a storm rolling in from far away, just the low hum of engines in the distance. People heard them before they saw them. Then one night, the roar of motorcycles broke the calm silence of the town. A group of 6 or 7 riders, dressed in heavy leather jackets, thundered down Main Street, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They weren't there to visit or to pass through quietly. They wanted to be noticed. Shopkeepers shut their doors earlier than usual. Families peered nervously from behind curtains. Nobody wanted trouble. But the bikers wanted attention, and they got it. They parked their bikes outside the gas station, laughing loudly, revving their engines for no reason other than to shake the peace out of the night. For Daniel, who walked home from the library almost every evening, the sound of those engines became a new part of life. At first, he simply listened, alert but distant. He thought maybe they would pass through and leave, like storms always did. But storms usually moved on. These men stayed. Within days, the bikers began to make their presence known in ways that unsettled everyone. They leaned against shop windows, staring too long at customers as they came and went. They shouted across streets, mocking people for fun. A few times, they tipped over trash bins, scattering waste across sidewalks. Nothing extreme, nothing that could be reported as a serious crime, but just enough to disturb the air of safety that the town had always carried. The townsfolk whispered among themselves. At the diner where Daniel's mother worked, conversations grew tense. "They don't belong here," one old man muttered. "Why isn't anyone doing something?" a woman asked, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. But no one offered solutions. People avoided eye contact with the bikers, crossed streets to walk the other way, and lowered their voices whenever engines roared past. Daniel noticed all of this. He noticed how fear slowly began to spread like smoke in the air, thin at first, but choking after a while. He saw his mother frown more often, glancing out the diner's windows as if she expected them to show up at any moment. And he felt something stir inside him, though he kept it hidden like always. One evening, as Daniel walked home with a bag of groceries, he passed the small grocery store at the corner of the street. 2 of the bikers were outside, laughing loudly as they leaned on their motorcycles. Their voices carried easily, echoing through the nearly empty street. Daniel didn't slow down, didn't look their way, but he could feel their eyes on him. For a brief second, he wondered if they saw what no one else could, that he wasn't as helpless as he looked. But then they laughed again, paying him no mind, and he slipped past unnoticed. At home, Daniel placed the groceries on the counter and sat silently at the table. His mother looked tired, her hair tied back loosely, her apron still dusted with flour from the diner's kitchen. She forced a smile, but Daniel could see the weight behind it. "Long day?" he asked gently. She nodded. The bikers were hanging around near the diner today. Some customers didn't even come inside, they were too scared. "This isn't the town I grew up in, Daniel. People are starting to stay home." Daniel listened quietly. He wanted to say, "I can protect us. You don't need to be afraid." But he didn't. He knew his father would remind him, strength is not about showing off. It's about knowing the right time. And Daniel knew this wasn't the time. Still, he couldn't ignore the truth. Trouble had arrived, and it wasn't going away soon. The bikers became bolder with each passing week. They began revving their engines late at night, waking children and rattling windows. They stopped at the gas station, refusing to pay right away, laughing as the nervous cashier hesitated to argue. Once, they blocked traffic on Main Street, parking their bikes across the road just to watch cars honk and drivers panic. The sheriff tried to keep order, but everyone could see he was outnumbered and overwhelmed. He spoke firmly when he confronted them, but the bikers only smirked, knowing no one in the town had the courage to truly stand against them. They weren't just men on motorcycles anymore, they had become shadows of fear that lingered long after their engines faded. Daniel's classmates whispered about the bikers, too. Some of the older boys thought they were exciting, dangerous in a way that seemed cool. But most students felt uneasy, lowering their voices when the subject came up. Daniel, as always, stayed quiet, listening but never adding much. He didn't need to say what he thought, he felt it deep in his bones. He knew the bikers weren't going to leave easily. One night, Daniel stood in his garage, sweat dripping down his face as he practiced strikes against the heavy bag. The steady thud of his fists echoed in the silence. He wasn't angry, anger had no place in his training. He was focused, controlled. Each movement reminded him of his father's voice, guiding him like a shadow. He didn't train to fight. He trained to be ready. Outside, the distant rumble of engines drifted through the air again. Daniel paused, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths. The sound was closer this time, circling the town like wolves testing their prey. He closed his eyes, tightening his fists. He knew it was only a matter of time before the storm that had rolled into town would crash directly into his path. And when it did, he would have no choice but to step out of the shadows he had hidden in for so long. The evening was calm, the sky painted with soft shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Daniel had just left the library, a worn book tucked under his arm, the streets quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. This was his favorite time of day, when the noise of the town settled, when he could walk home slowly, thinking about stories, ideas, or simply nothing at all. But that night felt different. As he turned down the narrow street that led home, the faint roar of engines broke the silence. At first, it was far away, like a storm still beyond the hills. Daniel's pace quickened slightly, but he told himself it was nothing. Yet with each step, the engines grew louder, closer, until the sound seemed to surround him. Then they appeared. 3 motorcycles turned the corner behind him, headlights flashing in the growing darkness. Their engines echoed off the brick walls, filling the empty street with an unsettling growl. Daniel didn't turn around, but he knew they were following him. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and kept walking. His heart beat faster, but his face stayed calm. His father's words whispered in his mind, "Stay aware. Control your breathing. Do not panic." The bike slowed as they reached him, circling like predators testing their prey. One rider revved his engine sharply, making the noise bounce between the walls. Another laughed loudly, a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the air. Daniel kept moving forward, each step steady, refusing to show fear. "Hey, look at this one," a voice called out from one of the bikers. "Walking home with his little book. Cute." The others laughed, their voices dripping with sarcasm. Daniel didn't answer. He kept his eyes forward, focusing on the cracked pavement beneath his feet. But ignoring them only seemed to encourage them more. One of the bikers pulled ahead, blocking Daniel's path. He removed his helmet, revealing a man with sharp eyes and a grin that looked more like a challenge. The other two circled behind, trapping Daniel between them. "Where you headed, kid?" the biker asked, his tone playful but edged with menace. "Don't you know these streets aren't safe at night?" Daniel met his gaze for the first time. His face remained calm, his voice steady. "I'm just going home." The biker smirked. "Home, huh? And what's in the bag?" "Something worth sharing." He reached out, tapping Daniel's backpack lightly with his gloved hand. Daniel tightened his grip on the strap but didn't move. "Just books." The biker laughed, throwing his head back. "Books? Did you hear that? He's carrying books." The others roared with laughter, as if the idea itself was a joke. One of them leaned closer, his breath smelling of smoke. "What are you gonna do with books, kid? Read us to death." The group erupted again in cruel laughter, their voices echoing against the empty buildings. But Daniel stood quietly, his eyes steady, his breathing slow. He didn't rise to their taunts, didn't react to their insults. His stillness unsettled them more than any words could. The biker in front frowned. "You're awful calm for someone surrounded. Most kids would be shaking by now." Daniel said nothing. Inside, his heart thudded like a drum, but his years of training kept his body controlled. He shifted his weight slightly, feet firm on the ground, ready without looking ready. The biker stepped closer, his grin widening. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe," he shoved Daniel's shoulder lightly. "You're too scared to speak." The shove wasn't hard, but it was enough to test him. Daniel staggered back a step but quickly found his balance. He didn't strike back, didn't lash out. His father's lesson echoed in his head, never fight first. Let them show their hand. "Come on," another biker urged, his tone impatient. "Stop playing with him. Let's take the bag and go." Daniel's grip on the strap tightened further. He knew what would come next. He also knew he couldn't show fear. Fear was exactly what they wanted. The biker in front reached again, this time grabbing at Daniel's backpack. Daniel pulled back, his calm eyes locking onto the man's. For a moment, there was silence. Just the sound of engines idling, breaths held, the tension stretching thin like a wire ready to snap. And in that silence, something flickered in the biker's eyes. Confusion. Why wasn't this kid trembling? Why wasn't he begging? Why wasn't he reacting like all the others had? The laughter faded, replaced with irritation. "You think you're tough," the biker growled, his tone darker now. "You think standing there quiet makes you strong." Daniel still didn't answer. He knew words wouldn't matter. What mattered was patience. What mattered was control. Then, in a flash, the biker shoved him harder, pushing him back against the wall. Daniel's book fell to the ground, pages scattering slightly in the evening breeze. The sound echoed in Daniel's mind louder than the engines. For the first time, Daniel moved not out of panic, but with calm precision. His eyes sharpened, his breathing steady. His father's voice was clear as if he were standing right beside him. "Wait for the moment. When it comes, you will know." The moment had come. The bikers still thought they had a harmless teenager pinned against a wall. They didn't realize the boy they mocked had been preparing for this very kind of moment for years. They didn't realize that Daniel wasn't trapped at all. And they certainly didn't realize that everything was about to change. The street was quiet except for the low rumble of engines. The bikers had Daniel cornered, their shadows stretching long against the brick walls under the flickering streetlight. His book lay on the ground, its pages fluttering in the soft evening wind. To the bikers, it looked like victory. To Daniel, it felt like a test. The leader, the one who had shoved him against the wall, leaned closer. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a sharp edge in his eyes. He pressed a gloved hand against Daniel's chest, pinning him lightly. "You're not so calm now, are you?" he said, his tone mocking but tinged with frustration. Daniel's heartbeat was quick, but his breathing stayed even. His father's words whispered in his memory, "Fear is natural, but control is strength." He locked eyes with the man, refusing to look away. One of the other bikers laughed. "What's the point of talking to him? Just grab his bag and let's go. We don't have all night." The leader nodded slightly, then yanked at Daniel's backpack strap. The sudden pull almost dragged Daniel forward, but he tightened his grip. He didn't let go. His calmness seemed to annoy them more than his silence. Still holding on, the leader muttered. He shoved Daniel again, harder this time. The backpack slipped from Daniel's shoulder, but he caught it before it fell. His stance shifted without him thinking, feet apart, knees bent slightly, balanced. It was subtle, but his body had already entered a state of readiness. The bikers noticed. "Look at him," one sneered. "He thinks he's gonna fight us? This kid." The laughter rose again, sharp and cruel, but Daniel didn't flinch. He lowered the backpack to the ground slowly, his eyes steady. His father had taught him that protecting himself didn't always mean attacking, it meant controlling the space, the energy, and the timing. The leader stepped closer until their faces were only inches apart. "I don't like that look in your eyes, kid," he said quietly. "Like you know something we don't." Daniel said nothing. The leader's patience snapped. He shoved Daniel again, harder than before, his hand pressing against Daniel's shoulder. "Say something," he demanded. "Or are you too scared to speak?" Daniel's silence was more powerful than any insult. He didn't realize it, but his stillness was making them uneasy. The bikers thrived on fear, on seeing people beg, stammer, or run. But this boy wasn't giving them what they wanted. The second biker, the one with the smoke-stained laugh, grew impatient. He kicked Daniel's book across the ground, the pages bending under his boot. "Enough wasting time," he muttered. "Let's rough him up a little. Maybe then he'll learn to respect us." Daniel's heart tightened as he saw the book scuff across the pavement. It wasn't just paper to him, it was a symbol of peace, of who he was outside the shadows. But he didn't move yet. He stayed calm, waiting. The third biker moved in, reaching out to grab Daniel's arm. His grip was strong, rough, but Daniel stayed loose, not resisting immediately. He let the man's hand tighten, let the moment stretch. His father's voice echoed clearly now, "When they think they have you, that is when they are most careless." The leader grinned cruelly, sensing victory. "You see? Not so tough after all. Just another weak kid." But beneath Daniel's calm eyes, something sharpened. His body was a coil, ready to spring. His patience had been tested, his restraint stretched thin. He hadn't struck yet because he knew once he moved, there was no going back. The leader grabbed Daniel's collar with one hand and lifted slightly, trying to force him against the wall again. The movement was sloppy, fueled by arrogance. That was the mistake Daniel had been waiting for. Inside, Daniel's focus narrowed. He could hear the engines idling, the rough breaths of the men around him, the scrape of a boot on the pavement. His body responded like it had been trained to for years. Calm. Precise. Controlled. Still, he gave them one last chance. He spoke for the first time, his voice low and steady. "Let go." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. For a moment, the bikers froze, glancing at one another. It wasn't the voice of a trembling teenager. It was firm, steady, unshaken. The leader sneered. "Or what?" He shoved Daniel again, pressing harder. That was the final line. Daniel's muscles tightened, his stance shifting completely into balance. His silence had ended. His training was no longer hidden. The bikers had pushed too far. The storm that had lingered quietly in Daniel's heart for years was about to break open, and they didn't even realize how much regret was waiting for them on the other side. For a moment, time felt heavy. The street light flickered above them, casting shadows across the narrow road. Daniel stood pressed against the wall, the leader gripping his collar with a fistful of arrogance. The other bikers looked on with smirks, certain this quiet teenager was about to break. But Daniel's eyes told a different story. They weren't the eyes of fear, they were sharp, steady, unblinking. "Let go," Daniel repeated, his voice calm, almost gentle. The leader laughed. "Or what?" His voice carried mockery, but a thread of unease ran beneath it. He shoved Daniel harder against the wall. And then it happened. Daniel moved not wildly, not angrily, but with precision that stunned the air itself. His hand snapped upward, breaking the leader's grip in one swift motion. At the same time, Daniel shifted his body, twisting free and stepping aside. The leader stumbled forward, his balance lost for a moment. The movement was so fast, so controlled, that the bikers froze in disbelief. "What?" the one muttered, his eyes widening. Daniel didn't lunge or attack. He simply steadied himself, feet planted, body balanced, eyes alert. He looked calm, but his entire being was focused, ready. Years of silent training had poured into this moment, and his body knew exactly what to do. The leader regained his footing and turned, anger flashing in his eyes. "You think you can play tough, kid?" He lunged at Daniel, swinging a heavy arm meant to slam him back. But Daniel was no longer the quiet boy they thought they had cornered. He ducked under the strike, moving smoothly, and let the man's own momentum carry him forward. The leader staggered again, his boots scraping against the pavement. The second biker rushed in now, frustrated, his hands outstretched to grab Daniel. But Daniel reacted instantly. With a swift sidestep, he deflected the man's reach and lightly pushed his arm away, making him stumble into the wall. It wasn't brute strength that moved him, it was Daniel's control, his timing, his precision. The bikers were no longer laughing. The third one stepped back slightly, eyes darting between his friends and the boy standing calmly in front of them. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice tight. The leader growled. His pride had been bruised, and nothing stung worse for a man who lived on intimidation. He came at Daniel again, faster this time, swinging with force. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He shifted his stance, blocked the strike with his forearm, and redirected the man's arm to the side. It was clean, efficient, and shockingly quick. The leader grunted, clutching his arm, his face twisting with frustration. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't taunt. His silence was more powerful than any words. For years, he had trained in the quiet of his garage, repeating the same movements until they became second nature. His father had taught him that real skill wasn't about flashy moves, it was about control, awareness, and discipline. And now, in this moment, all those lessons lived in him. The second biker tried again, this time charging at Daniel with frustration in his steps. But Daniel's response was simple and effective. He shifted aside, his footwork smooth, and guided the biker's shoulder with just enough pressure to throw him off balance. The man stumbled, nearly tripping over his own boots. "You've got to be kidding me," the third biker muttered, his confidence slipping. Daniel stood tall, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. His fists weren't raised like a brawler's. Instead, his hands were open, relaxed, but his posture screamed readiness. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was proving he could end one. The leader's pride boiled over. He shouted, his voice echoing down the empty street, and charged again. This time, he aimed low, trying to grab Daniel and force him down. But Daniel reacted with calm precision. He shifted his weight, lowered his stance, and redirected the man's force. In one smooth motion, the leader was thrown off balance and fell to one knee, stunned by how easily his strength had been turned against him. The other bikers froze, their mouths slightly open. They weren't used to this. They were used to people cowering, begging, or running. They weren't used to calm defiance. And they certainly weren't used to losing control. Daniel didn't advance. He didn't strike back with cruelty. He simply stood, steady and unshaken, waiting for the next move. His silence spoke louder than shouting ever could. You little," the leader growled, pushing himself back up. His voice carried anger, but also something else, doubt. The second biker shook his head. "Boss, this isn't normal. He knows what he's doing." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, his breath still steady. He could feel the moment shifting. The balance of power was no longer with them, it was with him. He hadn't needed to shout or throw wild strikes. His control alone had turned the tide. And the bikers knew it. The leader clenched his fists, but hesitation flickered in his eyes. He wanted to strike again, but some part of him finally realized that this wasn't just a quiet teenager they had picked on. This was someone trained, someone disciplined, someone dangerous in ways they hadn't expected. Daniel didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His calm posture told them everything: if you keep pushing, you will regret it. The tension thickened, the air heavy with silence. The bikers shifted uneasily, glancing at each other, their confidence crumbling. The turning point had come. The quiet boy they thought they could scare had revealed his strength. And for the first time, the bikers felt something they weren't used to feeling. Fear. For a long moment, the street was filled only with the sound of engines idling and heavy breathing. The bikers stood frozen, their earlier laughter gone, their smirks wiped away. They had mocked Daniel as a harmless boy, but now they saw something they had never expected. The quiet teenager before them wasn't weak. He was calm, controlled, and unshaken in the face of their aggression. The leader's pride was burning. His jaw clenched as he stared at Daniel, still steady and silent. He hated that look, the unafraid stare of someone who couldn't be broken. "Enough games," he growled, his voice rough with frustration. He stepped forward, fists tightening. "You're done, kid." The other bikers, though less sure now, followed his lead. They spread out, circling Daniel again, trying to regain the control they had lost. But their movements were different this time, less confident, more cautious. Deep down, each of them felt the unease crawling through their veins. Daniel stood calmly, his breathing slow, his stance balanced. His father's words were alive in him: do not fight with anger. Do not fight to win. Fight only to end the threat. He didn't see them as enemies to destroy, but as obstacles to overcome. The first move came from the second biker, the one who had mocked him about the books earlier. He charged in with a wild swing, his face twisted with frustration. Daniel shifted smoothly, blocking the strike and redirecting it with practiced precision. The biker stumbled forward, nearly colliding with the wall. Before the man could recover, Daniel stepped aside and let his own momentum carry him further away. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't violent. But it was enough. The biker staggered, his confidence shattered. The third biker, nervous but desperate to prove himself, rushed at Daniel with a heavy push. Daniel met him with balance, his feet firm, his arms guiding the shove away. In one fluid motion, he stepped aside and tapped the man's shoulder, sending him spinning off balance. The biker stumbled, nearly falling, and let out a frustrated curse under his breath. Now it was the leader's turn. His pride couldn't take any more humiliation. With a roar of anger, he lunged at Daniel, swinging with everything he had. But Daniel was ready. He ducked low, his movements smooth and precise, and the leader's swing cut through empty air. Daniel shifted behind him, his body calm as water, and the man stumbled forward, caught completely off guard. The leader turned quickly, his face red with rage. But in his eyes, there was something new: fear. Daniel didn't strike. He didn't attack. He simply stood there, calm and steady, waiting. His silence was louder than any threat could ever be. It told them, "You cannot break me. You cannot win." The bikers hesitated, looking at one another. Their confidence had crumbled. Their loud engines, their mocking laughter, their intimidating presence, all of it meant nothing against this boy's quiet strength. The second biker stepped back, shaking his head. "Boss, this kid's not normal," he muttered. "He's trained. He knows what he's doing." The leader glared at him, then back at Daniel. His pride wanted to strike again, but his body remembered the humiliation of failing twice. His fists clenched, but his steps didn't move forward. Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady, calm, and without anger. "This ends now. Leave." The words were simple, but they carried a weight the bikers couldn't ignore. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a challenge. It was a command delivered with the certainty of someone who didn't need to prove himself. The bikers looked at one another, their earlier bravado gone. They had thought they were predators circling easy prey. Instead, they had discovered that the quiet boy they mocked was stronger, calmer, and more dangerous than they could handle. The second biker muttered under his breath, "Let's just go." The leader's pride flared again. He wanted to argue, to shout, to save face. But the truth was clear. His men were shaken. His own confidence was broken. And Daniel stood before him, steady as a mountain, unwilling to be moved. Finally, with a frustrated growl, the leader stepped back. "This isn't over, kid," he spat, though his words carried little conviction. He turned toward his bike, his steps heavy with anger and shame. The others followed, their shoulders tense, their eyes avoiding Daniel's. They mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring louder as if the noise could cover their humiliation. One by one, they sped off into the night, their tires screeching against the pavement. Daniel stood still, watching them disappear into the distance. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, his hands slowly unclenching. The adrenaline still pulsed through him, but his face remained calm. He had done what he needed to, no more, no less. The street grew quiet again. The only sound left was the faint flutter of his book's pages on the ground. Slowly, Daniel bent down, picking it up. He brushed off the dust, straightened the bent cover, and tucked it back under his arm. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He didn't feel victorious. He simply felt steady. His father's voice echoed in his heart once more, "Real strength is knowing when to stand, and when to walk away." That night, the bikers rode away not with triumph, but with regret. They had thought they could frighten a boy. Instead, they discovered the boy they mocked was stronger than any of them could imagine. And though they left with angry words, deep down they knew the truth. They would never forget the calm eyes of the teenager who stood against them without fear. The night grew quiet once more. The sound of engines faded into the distance until there was nothing left but silence and the hum of a single flickering streetlight. Daniel stood still in the middle of the road, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. His fists slowly relaxed, his shoulders loosening after the storm of tension. The street that had felt like a trap minutes ago now felt like his own ground again. He bent down and picked up his book, the one the bikers had kicked aside. Its cover was bent, pages slightly wrinkled, but it was still intact. He brushed the dust away carefully, as though handling something precious. To Daniel, it wasn't just a book, it was proof that even in chaos, pieces of peace could survive. He tucked it under his arm once more and began walking home, his steps slow, steady, and calm. As he moved through the empty streets, he thought about what had just happened. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't bragged, and he hadn't tried to humiliate them. He had simply defended himself with the discipline he had learned, the lessons his father had drilled into him since childhood. His father's voice felt close again, echoing in his heart, "Real strength is quiet. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply stands when needed." When Daniel finally reached home, the lights of the small house glowed softly. Inside, his mother was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She looked up as he entered, worry written across her face. "You're late," she said gently, though her voice carried a nervous edge. Daniel gave her a small smile. "I stopped by the library. Lost track of time." She studied his face for a moment, searching for signs of trouble. Daniel's calm expression gave her no reason to worry, so she nodded, though her eyes lingered on him longer than usual. "All right. Go get some rest, Daniel." He nodded and carried his book to his room. Closing the door softly, he placed it on his desk and sat on the edge of his bed. The events of the night replayed in his mind, every movement, every breath, every choice. He could still see the look in the bikers' eyes when they realized they had misjudged him. That look of fear and regret would stay with them, just as his father's lessons had stayed with him. Daniel didn't feel proud in the way others might have. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt steady, clear. He had done what was necessary, nothing more. That was enough. The next morning, the town buzzed with whispers. People at the diner spoke quietly about the bikers. They had roared through Main Street again, but something was different. They didn't shout at shopkeepers. They didn't tip over trash bins. They didn't mock anyone in passing. Instead, they rode fast and left quickly, avoiding long glances and loud voices. "They're quieter," one man remarked to Daniel's mother as she poured him coffee. "Maybe they finally realized they're not welcome here," another said. Daniel sat at a corner table, eating breakfast silently. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. He didn't need to. The change in the bikers' behavior was enough proof that the lesson had been delivered. At school, Daniel walked the hallways as usual, his book under his arm. His classmates didn't notice anything different about him. To them, he was still the quiet, polite boy who kept to himself. And Daniel preferred it that way. His strength wasn't something to display, it was something to keep close, like a secret only revealed when the time demanded it. But deep down, Daniel knew things had changed. Not on the outside, on the inside. He had been tested, and he had stood his ground. He had discovered that his father's training wasn't just about moves or techniques, it was about discipline, patience, and control. And now, more than ever, he understood the weight of those lessons. That evening, Daniel returned to his garage. The punching bag hung in its usual place, worn from years of practice. He wrapped his hands slowly, breathing in the familiar scent of dust and leather. When he struck the bag, it wasn't with anger or pride, it was with calm rhythm, each movement steady, controlled, balanced. He was no longer just a boy carrying his father's memory. He was a young man shaping it into his own life. Outside, the night air was still. Somewhere far away, the distant hum of motorcycles echoed faintly, but they didn't come near. The bikers had learned their lesson. They had left that quiet teenager with a new kind of respect, fearful respect. And they carried their regret like a shadow wherever they rode next. Daniel finished his training and sat quietly on the floor of the garage, staring at the stars through the open window. He thought of his father, of the way he used to stand in this very spot, guiding him with patience. A small smile touched Daniel's lips. "I did it, Dad," he whispered softly. "I remembered. The world outside would never know what had happened on that quiet street. The townsfolk would never guess that the boy with books had faced down a gang of bikers and stood unbroken. But Daniel didn't care about recognition. All he cared about was staying true to the lessons that had shaped him. And so he returned to his quiet life, still the polite, shy teenager, still carrying books under his arm, still walking home through the same streets. But inside, he carried a strength no one could take away. A strength built on discipline, patience, and calm. The bikers had threatened him, mocked him, and underestimated him. And for that, they had walked away with something they never expected: regret.